She was 34 years old, and down to the coins she could hold in one fist. The man who cast her out into that condition was Silas Reeve, president of the Ambrose Landing Trust Bank, and he did it the way men like him always do it, with a smile, and a stack of paper, and a debt that had somehow grown teeth overnight. What she had left, after the house and the ferry rights and the good name her husband had built were signed away to satisfy that debt, was $11.40, a wooden trunk, and a lean red-coated hound named Copper, who had not left her side since the morning her husband died. So when the auctioneer at the old rope walk on the edge of town called for bids on a building nobody wanted, a long dim cobwebbed shed where cordage had once been twisted by the mile, and the crowd laughed at the very idea of it, she raised her hand and said $12, and bought the whole ruined place with the last of what she had in this world. It was, by any sober measure, a foolish thing to do. But we have found, in gathering these stories, that the things folks call foolish are sometimes only wisdom wearing a disguise nobody has learned to recognize yet, and that somewhere in the dark of that rope walk, coiled where no auctioneer's eye had thought to look, was a secret that would not only turn her foolish bid into the making of her life, but would set an entire town back on its feet. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Temperance Calloway and her faithful dog Copper. If a story like this one warms something in you, we would be glad to hear about it in the comments below, because that is how we know to keep finding stories worth the telling. Temperance Ann Calloway, called Tempe by everyone who loved her, and a good many who didn't, was born in the bluegrass country of Kentucky in the year 1852, the only daughter of a ropemaker named Josiah Wren, who ran a rope walk of his own, along a low stone building that smelled forever of tar and hemp, and the sweet dust of fiber being drawn. Her father did not believe that rope making was a trade too rough for a girl's hands, and so from the time she was tall enough to reach the spinning wheel's crank, he taught her the whole of it, how to choose hemp that had been properly retted, neither too green nor too brittle, how to draw the fibers into an even sliver, with no lumps to weaken the twist, how to walk backward down the long walk, paying out strand after strand, while the wheel behind her spun the yarn tight, how to lay 3 strands into a true rope with a tension so even that a man could trust his life to it. She learned, too, the quieter lessons that came wrapped inside the louder ones, that a rope was only as strong as its most neglected fiber, that patience shown to raw material was repaid 100-fold in the finished cord, and that a thing considered too plain, or too humble to matter, was very often the thing holding everything else together. Her father used to say that a length of good rope was the most honest object a person could own, because it never pretended to be more than it was, and never failed to be exactly what it claimed. And he said it so often, and with such quiet conviction, that Tempe grew into womanhood believing it the way other daughters believe a favorite hymn, without ever quite examining why it had settled so deep. It was on a spring morning in her 16th year that a half-starved red hound pup wandered into her father's rope walk, chased by a pack of boys with stones, and Tempe waded into the middle of that cruelty, without a thought for herself, and gathered the shivering creature into her apron. She named him Copper, for the burnished color of his coat, and though her father grumbled about another mouth to feed, the dog would not leave her heel from that day forward, sleeping across the threshold of her room, and following her the length of the rope walk, each morning, as though he too had been apprenticed to the trade. In those first weeks, he was too weak to do more than watch her from a nest of old rope scraps, but he mended quickly under her care, and by midsummer, he had taken to trotting the length of the walk floor beside her, matching his pace to the slow backward rhythm of her rope laying so precisely that her father took to joking he had hired the dog as her apprentice, instead of paying him wages. It was Copper who taught her, without meaning to, something her father's lessons had not quite covered, which was that loyalty freely given was worth more than any wage, and that the truest partnerships in this world are not bought but earned. One small kindness answered by another, until neither party can quite recall which one started it. There was a particular evening, not long after Copper had grown into his full size, when a summer storm caught Tempe out on the walk floor after dark, the lantern guttering, and the wind tearing at the loose boards overhead. And it was Copper who found the door in the pitch black, when she had turned herself around twice trying, pressing his flank against her leg, and leading her step by careful step to the threshold, as surely as if the building itself had spoken through him. Her father, watching her tell that story at supper, with the dog's head heavy across her feet, remarked that a good rope and a good dog shared the same virtue, which was that neither one boasted of its own usefulness until the moment a person truly needed it. And Tempe carried that thought with her long after she had left her father's house, long after the rope walk of her childhood had passed to other hands, the way a person carries the smell of a particular season, or the sound of a particular voice, without quite realizing how deeply it had settled into her. She was 22 when she married Ezra Calloway, a soft-spoken young man from the Dakota country, who had come east to buy breeding stock, and left instead with a wife, a dog, and a head full of plans for a ferry crossing on the Missouri River at a bend called Ambrose Landing, where the current ran wide and slow enough to make a safe crossing, but the banks were too soft for a bridge. Ezra had inherited the crossing rights from his uncle, along with a cable ferry that depended, more than anything else in the world, on rope, and Tempe brought to that marriage the one skill that made the whole enterprise sound rather than a gamble. She twisted the ferry's guide cables herself in those early years, splicing and serving them with her father's careful hand, and the town of Ambrose Landing grew up around that crossing the way towns grow up around any dependable thing: a general store, a church, a schoolhouse, a scatter of homes, all of it held together, in a manner of speaking, by the rope Tempe made with her own two hands, and by the dog who slept at her feet while she made it. For 12 years that life held. Ezra ran the crossing, Tempe kept the cables sound, and Copper, who lived a hound's long and comfortable life at their hearth, grew gray about the muzzle, but never lost his habit of walking the riverbank each evening at Tempe's side, nose down, reading the day's news in the mud the way other creatures read a newspaper. Ambrose Landing was not a rich town, but it was a whole one, the kind of place where a stranger's wagon wheel breaking on the road meant 6 neighbors appearing with tools before he had finished cursing, and Tempe, for all the plainness of her days, counted herself among the fortunate. She had by then taught 2 of the ferry hands her father's methods of splicing and serving cable, though neither ever matched her patience for the work, and it became a quiet point of pride in Ambrose Landing that the Calloway crossing had never once, in over a decade, lost a cable to the current, a record other river towns could rarely claim. Copper by then was old in dog years but not yet slow, and it was his habit each dawn to walk the bank ahead of Ezra, as he checked the guide cable's tension, circling the cottonwood snags, and testing the mud with his nose before Ezra ever set foot near the water. A small ritual that had become so ordinary to the household that no one remarked on it anymore, the way no one remarks on the sun rising. It was that same ritual he was performing on the morning the cable finally gave way, though on this particular morning Ezra, hurrying because a wagon party waited on the far bank, and the spring flood had made everyone impatient, walked out onto the crossing platform before Copper had finished his circuit of the snag, and the dog's warning bark, when it came a half-minute too late to matter. The fall, when it came the way falls so often do, wearing the shape of an ordinary Tuesday. Ezra had gone out at first light, to tend the guide cable where a spring flood had strained it against a fresh fallen cottonwood snag, and the cable, old past its safe years, and patched one time too many by a hand less careful than Tempe's own, parted beneath him without warning and threw him into the current. They found him 2 days downstream, and the town buried him beside the little church whose bell he had helped hang. Tempe was 32 years old, a widow with a ferry crossing that could no longer legally operate without a man's signature on the license, in a territory whose courts were slow to recognize a woman's claim to her own husband's business, however capably she had run half of it in fact if not in name. It was Silas Reeve who arrived within the week, dressed in his town bank black, offering what he called a friend's assistance, alone against the crossing to see her through the licensing tangle, secured, he said, only as a formality, by the house and the ferry equipment. Tempe, grieving, and cornered, and trusting a man she had done business with for a decade, signed where he pointed. It took Reeve less than a year to call the note, claiming a clause she had not read closely enough, a clause his own clerk had drafted, and by the time the territorial rail line bypassed Ambrose Landing altogether, in favor of a shorter route 12 miles north, killing what remained of the ferry trade in a single stroke of a surveyor's pencil, Reeve had already begun quietly buying up the abandoned parcels along the old crossing road, for what the newspapers, when they noticed at all, called a song. Tempe lost the house. She lost the ferry rights. She lost, in the space of 11 months, every visible thing her marriage had built, and was left standing in the yard of a home that was no longer hers with a trunk, a fistful of coins, and copper pressed hard against her leg as if he could hold her upright by sheer will. The auction of the old ropewalk building took place on a gray October morning, the building itself a leftover from the town's earlier ambitions, thrown up some 30 years before by the original founders, on the theory that a river town would always need its own rope for ferries and wells, and mine hoists, rather than paying freight to have it shipped in. It had done good business once, under a ropemaker who had since died without heirs, and had stood empty and sagging for the better part of a decade, its long walk floor buried under drifted leaves, its spinning gear rusted fast, its one virtue being that it was too worthless for Silas Reeve to have bothered adding it to his quiet collection of parcels. When the auctioneer, a cheerful man named Gantry who ran most of the county's forced sales, called the rope walk up for bid, a ripple of laughter went through the crowd gathered mostly to watch Tempe Calloway's misfortunes sold off piece by piece, because everyone present understood the building to be a pile of rotten lumber with delusions of value. Tempe, standing at the back with Copper's rope lead wound twice around her wrist, heard in that laughter an odd quiet certainty settle over her, the same certainty her father used to describe, when he chose a length of hemp that looked unremarkable to every eye but his own, and she raised her hand and bid the whole of what she had, $12, into a silence that followed the laughter like an afterthought. No one bid against her. Gantry's gavel came down, and the ruin of the Ambrose Landing ropewalk, and whatever it contained, belonged to Temperance Calloway. She moved into the ropewalk that same week, because it was that or the church basement, and there was a stubborn pride in her that would not accept charity while she still had walls of her own, however many of them let the wind through. The building itself ran nearly 200 feet from its front doors to its far wall, a shape she recognized in her bones long before she understood it with her eyes, the same long narrow proportions her father's ropewalk had held, built that way so a ropemaker could walk the full length of a strand while it was twisted rather than coil it prematurely and weaken it. Leaves had drifted into corners in deep, dry piles, and the spinning gear at the head of the walk stood locked with rust, but the bones of the place were sound, oak beams pegged rather than nailed, and Tempe found herself, on that first cold evening, running her palm along the grain of the old wood, the way another woman might have run her hand along a piano she had not played in years, feeling for what still worked beneath the neglect. Copper explored the long building before she did, nose working along the base of the walk floor, and on their second night there, with a lantern throwing long shadows down that impossible length of empty track, he stopped dead at a section near the far wall where a coil of old ship's hawser rope, thick as a man's forearm and stiff with age, hung forgotten on a wooden peg, and began to whine and paw at the floorboards directly beneath it, in a manner so insistent that Tempe finally set down her broom and knelt to see what had caught him. The floorboards there were loose, not rotted, but deliberately loose, fitted with a care that the rest of the walk's ruin did not share, and beneath them she found not the rats she expected, but a shallow chamber, dry and lined with tarred cloth, empty now save for a scattering of straw and the faint, unmistakable smell of hemp oil that had long outlasted whatever it once protected. Copper would not leave the spot. He returned to it again and again over the following days, sniffing at the great coiled hawser on its peg with an intensity that finally made Tempe take the old rope down and look at it properly for the first time, and it was then she noticed what 30 years of dust had hidden, that the hawser's core, where a rope of that size ought to have held a heartstrand of ordinary fiber, felt wrong beneath her practiced hands, too rigid in some places, and hollow in others, as though something other than hemp had been wound into its center long ago by someone who understood, as she did, exactly how a length of rope is built. It took her the better part of 2 days, working with a marlinspike, and the patient, unhurried care her father had taught her for unlaying a rope without ruining it, to open that hawser strand by strand, Copper lying at her feet the whole while with his chin on his paws, as though standing watch over the work. The outer strands came away easily enough, brittle with age, and smelling of the tar that had once waterproofed them against a lifetime of river weather. But as she worked deeper toward the heart, she felt the marlinspike meet something that gave with a different resistance than dried hemp ought to give. A faint metallic hardness beneath layers of fiber that made her pause, and work the remaining strands loose with her fingers alone, rather than risk the spike scarring whatever lay beneath. Twice during that long patient unlaying she caught herself talking softly to Copper as she worked, the way her father used to talk to a rope while he laid it, telling it what was expected of it, and thanking it in advance for holding true, an old ropemaker's habit she had never shed, and had never before understood quite so well as she did in that dim, dust-moted light with her whole future balanced on the outcome of a single strand. What she found wound into its heart, wrapped in oiled canvas, and sealed with wax gone brittle as old honey, was a slender copper tube, and inside the tube, rolled tight enough to have survived 3 decades undisturbed, was a set of papers in a strong, old-fashioned hand. The original 1852 town charter of Ambrose Landing, signed by its handful of founding families, granting the land along the river bend, including the crossing, the mill site, and the very ground the rope walk stood upon, to the town in common, to be held in trust for the benefit of all its residents, and never sold outright to any single owner, together with a letter from the rope walk's builder, a founder named Josiah Wren, though whether kin to her own father's family she could not say, and never did discover, explaining that he had hidden both the charter and a modest fund of gold coin, wound into the hawser's heart for safe keeping against the day, which he plainly feared even then, that some future man of means might try to claim the common land as his own, meant, in his words, to be found and used when the town needed it most and not a day before. The gold amounted to some $400 in coin, a fortune to a woman who had bid away her last 12, but it was the charter that made Tempe's hands go unsteady as she read it a second time by lantern light, because she understood at once, turning the pages over with a ropemaker's care for not damaging what she held, that if this document was genuine and had never been legally set aside, then every parcel Silas Reeve had quietly bought up along the old crossing road, the very land the surveyors were even then walking with stakes and string for a new rail spur Reeve intended to sell to the railroad at an enormous profit, had never been his to buy in the first place, because it had never belonged to any private seller to sell. The whole of Reeve's scheme, patient and profitable, and dressed up in a decade of respectable paper, rested on a foundation that a dead man's foresight, and a living dog's nose, had just pulled out from beneath it. Word of what Tempe had found could not be kept quiet in a town the size of Ambrose Landing. Not once she carried the charter to the circuit clerk's office to ask, with careful innocence, whether such an old document could still hold force in law, and Silas Reeve arrived at the rope walk within 2 days of that inquiry, his black coat immaculate, his voice pitched to the same friendly register he had used the day he first offered her a loan against her grief. He proposed, with the air of a man doing a great and generous thing, to buy the rope walk and its contents from her outright for $100, more money, he pointed out, than the ruin was worth to any sensible person, and when Tempe declined, gently but without hesitation, his friendliness thinned to something with an edge in it, a reminder, delivered almost as an aside, that old documents were easily disputed. that circuit judges owed their appointments to men with influence, and that a woman alone with a dog and a rotting building would find it a hard fight to win against the Ambrose Landing Trust Bank. Copper, who had tolerated Reeve's presence with a stiff and watchful silence throughout the visit, rose then and placed himself squarely between the banker and Tempe, a low sound building in his chest that needed no translation, and Reeve, after a long moment, straightened his hat and left without another word, though not before Tempe saw, in the set of his jaw, that he had no intention of losing quietly what he had spent a decade building. In the days between Reeve's visit and whatever he intended to do next, Tempe felt the peculiar weight of a small town beginning to take sides. Felt it in the way certain neighbors crossed the road to greet her warmly, and others suddenly found urgent business in the opposite direction, and it was made plain to her one Sunday, outside the little church Ezra had helped raise, when Reeve himself, arriving late and leaving early as was his custom, paused just long enough on the church steps to remark to the gathered congregation, in a voice pitched to carry, that it was a sad thing to see grief drive a woman to invent treasure stories about a rotten shed, and sadder still that some folks seemed eager to believe it rather than face the plain fact that the town's only hope of surviving the rail line's indifference lay in the very spur project her fantasy now threatened to unravel. A few heads nodded along with him. Tempe said nothing in return, only stood with Copper's lead in her hand and let the moment pass, because she had learned from her father that a length of rope proves its strength under load and not under argument, and she trusted, with a steadiness that surprised even her, that the charter and the gold, and the dog who had found them, would prove their case in their own good time, without her needing to raise her voice to do it. Copper's warning proved sound within the week. Someone broke into the county records office by night, and disturbed the drawer where deed filings for the crossing road parcels were kept. Though a diligent young clerk named Amos Pruitt, who had grown fond of Tempe's cause after hearing her story, had already made careful copies at her request, and hidden them at his mother's house, so the tampering accomplished nothing but to confirm, in the minds of the few townsfolk who heard of it, that someone with a great deal to lose was moving with a great deal of urgency. Reeve next tried the town council directly, arguing before a hastily called meeting that an unrecorded charter 30 years buried in a rope had no standing against decades of properly filed deeds, that Ambrose Landing's future, what little the failed rail crossing had left it, depended on the new spur line going through as planned, with the parcels he had assembled, and that Tempe Calloway's discovery, however romantic a tale it made, was a fantasy dressed up to rob honest buyers of land they had paid for in good faith. It was a persuasive speech, delivered by a man long practiced at persuading, and Tempe watched more than a few neighbors' faces soften toward him even as her own case sat unspoken in her lap, because she had never been a woman good with speeches, only with rope and patience, and the slow sure work of her hands. It was Copper in the end, who tipped the balance, though not through any courtroom drama a scriptwriter might have invented for him. Old Amos Pruitt, going through the parcels Reeve claimed to have bought fair and square, noticed that every deed bore the same notary's seal and the same date, a detail so small that 3 separate clerks had missed it, and when he mentioned this to Tempe over supper, Copper, who had taken to lying near the trunk where she kept the recovered charter and the copies Amos had made, rose without prompting, walked to that trunk, and pawed at its latch with the same insistence he had once shown the loose floorboard above the buried chamber, as if to remind her that the answer she needed had been sitting close at hand the entire time. Tempe opened the trunk, laid the founding charter's careful, dated 1852 hand beside Reeve's uniformly dated deeds, and saw at once what a court would need only a glance to see as well, that every one of Reeve's parcel purchases had been backdated and notarized in a single sitting years after the fact, an act of forgery meant to make a private land grab look like a decade of patient, legitimate buying. The circuit judge who came through Ambrose Landing that winter was not a man Reeve had counted on influencing, a stern, unhurried jurist named Judge Ordway, who had seen enough forged paper in his years on the bench to recognize the smell of it from across a courtroom, and when Tempe laid before him the 1852 charter, the copper tube it had traveled in, Amos Pruitt's careful notary comparison, and the plain, unembellished account of how a dog's nose had led her to a hidden chamber beneath a rope-walk floor, the courtroom, packed to its back wall with townsfolk who had come expecting a spectacle, and found instead a woman speaking with the same unhurried steadiness she used when laying a length of rope, fell silent enough that the scratch of Ordway's own pen could be heard as he made his notes. Copper lay through the whole of it beneath the witness table, still and watchful, and it was remarked upon afterward, by more than one person present, that the old hound seemed to understand the gravity of the room better than some of the men arguing in it. Ordway ruled within the same session that the charter was genuine, that the crossing road land remained the common property of Ambrose Landing exactly as its founders had intended, and that Silas Reeve's parcel purchases, resting on forged and backdated deeds, were void from the moment of their making. Reeve, facing charges of forgery and fraud, that would in time strip him of his bank, and his standing both, left Ambrose Landing before the spring thaw, and was not seen in that country again. His fine house sold at auction the following year, to satisfy the very creditors he had once served, an irony not lost on anyone who remembered how he had made his fortune. The $400 in founder's gold, together with the town's restored claim to its own crossing road land, went not into Tempe's private purse, but into a trust fund exactly as old Josiah Wren had intended, and the town council, meeting that spring in the newly re-roofed schoolhouse, voted unanimously to place the fund under Tempe's own stewardship, a decision that struck her as no small turn of fortune given that barely half a year earlier, the same room had nodded along with Reeve's talk of fantasy and grief. The money went first to a proper new cable of forged wire rope for the ferry crossing, spliced under Tempe's own supervision, so that no future flood would part it as the old hemp cable had parted beneath Ezra, and what remained went to the schoolhouse roof, to a small reserve against hard winters, and to the reopening of the rope walk itself as a working shop, so that Ambrose Landing would never again need to ship its cordage in from towns that had never laughed at what held their own crossings together. It seemed to us, gathering the threads of this story, that the auction crowd who laughed the loudest on that gray October morning had been laughing at the one thing in Ambrose Landing that actually held the town together, a length of rope, and the one woman patient enough to know its worth by touch alone. There is a particular kind of laughter that gathers around a person standing at the bottom of their fortunes, a laughter that means no great unkindness, and yet cuts all the same, and Tempe had stood inside that laughter more than once during that hard year, first when Reeve's papers took her house, and again when her own neighbors watched her hand over her last coins for a shed with a caved roof, and we think it worth saying plainly that she never once answered that laughter with anger, only with the same quiet patience she gave to a length of unruly hemp, trusting that time and care would prove what mockery could not see. Tempe had lost a house, a livelihood, and a husband, and had been mocked for spending her last coins on a ruin nobody else would have, and yet it was precisely because she understood, in her hands and in her history, that plain and overlooked things are so very often the ones quietly bearing all the weight, that she alone among that crowd knew a rope walk was never truly worthless, only waiting for someone willing to look closely enough to see what it was still holding together. Copper, for his part, asked for no reward beyond the supper bowl he had always been given, and the place at Tempe's feet he had never once given up, and it struck more than one resident of Ambrose Landing, watching the two of them walk the rebuilt crossing road together that following spring, that the truest partnerships, the ones that end up saving a person, and sometimes a whole town besides, are rarely the loud or the celebrated ones, but the quiet, faithful, unglamorous kind, that simply refuse to leave your side. Tempe Calloway kept the rope walk standing the rest of her days, not as a ruin any longer, but as a working shop once more, teaching the trade her father had taught her to any hand in Ambrose Landing willing to learn it, and the town, in gratitude, took to calling the crossing road the Wren Road, after the founder whose foresight, and whose hidden gold had waited 3 decades in the dark, for exactly the right pair of hands, and the right dog's nose, to bring it back into the light. And so we find, once again, that the things this world calls foolish, a woman's last $12 spent on a rotten shed nobody wanted, are so very often only wisdom that has not yet been given the chance to prove itself, and that faithfulness, whether carried in a hound's steady heart, or a length of well-laid rope, is the quiet thread that holds a life, and sometimes an entire town, together long after louder things have failed. Thank you for spending this time with us, and with Temperance and Copper, and for letting their story sit alongside your own for a little while this evening. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that overlooked things, and overlooked people, are so often worth a second look, and that patience of the kind Tempe carried is rarely wasted, even when the world around it insists otherwise. We leave you with this question to turn over in your own quiet hour. What has your life carried in it that others were too quick to laugh at, and too quick to overlook? Until next time, stay close.